The last thing Silas Varnell ever tried to study was my face. Not the bottle in my hand, not the white glare of noon on the gallery rail, my face. Even in that final second, when any sensible man would have looked at the danger, he looked at the expression. That was his sickness. 22 years of my pain had trained him to search my eyes first, my mouth second, my hands last. So when I lifted the little glass bottle from the fold of my apron, he only leaned closer. "Hold still, Mercy," he said. "That look is new." Then I gave him a look he could never write down. The scream tore through Red Lantern Plantation before the overseers could turn their horses. It rolled over the cotton rows, across the cookhouse yard, through the open windows of the big house, and into the little room where he kept his blue ledger. The ledger where he had written us down like weather. The ledger where he had made a science of breaking people. That morning was April 3rd, 1854, in Lowndes County, Georgia. By sundown, the man who had watched 400 enslaved people for sport would be reaching into darkness, calling for the very woman he had called, Specimen M. My name is Mercy Clay. I was 39 years old, and for most of my life, Master Varnell believed I existed for one reason: to be observed. Red Lantern was not the largest plantation in Georgia, but it carried itself like a kingdom. The big house stood on a shallow rise above the fields, with 6 white columns, 2 long galleries, and windows placed so a man inside could see almost every working path without leaving his chair. That was not an accident. Silas Varnell had built the house like a watchtower. He was a narrow man with polished boots, soft hands, and pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink when someone else was in pain. He did not roar like other masters. He did not lose his temper often. That would have made him ordinary. Varnell liked order. He liked procedure. He liked to call cruelty by clean names, as if a fancy word could wash blood off a thing. He called beatings corrections. He called hunger pressure. He called grief useful response. And every night, in a locked blue ledger wrapped in calfskin, he wrote what those responses looked like. He wrote how a boy's mouth trembled when a dog barked too close. He wrote how long a mother could stand upright after seeing her daughter sold south. He wrote whether a man cursed before a whip fell, during it, or after he had no breath left for words. He wrote as if God had made him not a planter, but a scholar. The first time I saw the ledger, I was 17. I had been sold to Red Lantern from a rice place near the coast, still carrying salt rash on my legs and a stubbornness nobody had managed to beat flat. The housekeeper sent me to dust the library. Master Varnell was away at the courthouse. Mistress Eliza was sleeping with one of her headaches, and there on the desk sat the blue book, open under the morning light. I should have kept my hands to myself. Every rule in that house said a person like me was not meant to read, but the page had my name on it. Not Mercy, just the letter M, subject M, newly acquired female, approximately 17, strong resistance in posture, refuses full eye lowering, promising. That one word stayed with me longer than any lash mark. I did not understand then what I had promised him. I learned. In the years that followed, Master Varnell set himself the task of discovering how much of a person could be stripped away while the body still stood. He never said that aloud. Men like him do not confess. They make systems. He measured out our days like medicine. One week, he moved me from the field to the laundry, then back to the field, then into the kitchen at midnight, just to see what broken sleep did to a body. Another week, he ordered me to carry water past a locked bucket in August heat because he wanted to know whether thirst changed the voice before it changed the walk. Once, he told me my younger brother had died on the road to Mississippi. He watched me fall to my knees. He waited 3 full days before letting me hear from another hand that my brother had not died at all. He had only been sold, only. That was the kind of word slavery taught you to swallow. The ledger recorded everything. My silence, my shaking, the way I stopped asking questions, the way I stopped crying where he could see. That last part bothered him. He wrote that down too. Subject M demonstrates increasing control of facial response. Emotional activity continues behind the eyes, but surface evidence is reduced. Further testing required. Further testing. That was what he called the years of my life. By the time I was 30, I knew his habits better than he knew his Bible. He drank bitter coffee at first light. He stood on the East Gallery at 7. He carried the blue ledger under his left arm and a silver spyglass in his right hand, though the field was close enough for any honest man to see. He did not use that spyglass because he needed it. He used it because it made his looking feel important. He would lift it slowly, fix one person in the round bright circle, and wait. If a woman stumbled, he watched. If a child cried, he watched. If an old man's hand shook too badly to tie a cotton sack, he watched. Then he wrote. The spyglass became the most hated object on the place. More hated than the whip, because the whip ended. The looking did not. Children learned to freeze when the little silver tube turned their way. Women learned to hide grief behind the bend of a shoulder. Men learned to work with their faces empty, because any expression could become a page in Master Varnell's book. But a face cannot be empty forever. That was why he liked me. He believed I was a locked cabinet, and he had spent 22 years trying different keys. He never imagined the cabinet was watching him back. The plan began in the bleaching room, not with rage. Rage was too hot to trust. It began with a smell, sharp, clean, wrong. The laundry women used a harsh scouring wash on stained linen, strong enough that the white women warned their daughters not to come near it, but not so dangerous, apparently, that they would spare enslaved hands from lifting it. I had seen what it did to fabric. I had seen what it did when a drop landed on skin. Aunt Rosetta, who had worked washrooms longer than I had been alive, caught me staring at the covered crock one afternoon. Don't study that stuff too close, she whispered. It don't forgive. It don't forgive. I carried those words with me for months. I did not ask her how it was made. I did not need to. I only needed to know what it could take. And there was one thing in this world Master Varnell loved more than land, more than money, more than power. His sight, not seeing. Sight, there is a difference. Seeing is what ordinary people do. Sight, to him, was ownership. If he could look at a person, he believed he could reduce them. If he could describe a person, he believed he could command what their pain meant. If he could write it down, he believed the story belonged to him. So I decided to take the story away at the root. Not his life, his witness. At first, I hated myself for even thinking it. Then the children changed that. In February of 1854, a boy named Isaac dropped a basket of kindling on the back steps. He was 10, thin as Cain. He had a cough that never left his chest. The spilled sticks made no real trouble. But Master Varnell saw the boy flinch before the overseer spoke. That flinch interested him. 2 nights later, when I was sent to bring clean towels to the library, the blue ledger lay open again. I did not touch it. I only leaned close enough to read. Juvenile subjects display less skill in concealment. Early fear responses are cleaner, more immediate, less corrupted by adult strategy. Recommended. Increased attention to the young. The young. That was when my heart went cold enough to work. For 22 years, I had believed I was surviving him. That was not enough anymore. Survival would not save Isaac. It would not save Ruthie with the torn sleeve. It would not save the little twins who still whispered their mother's name into a rag at night because she had been sold 2 winters before. Master Varnell was not finished. He was expanding, and if nobody stopped him, he would turn children into the next chapter of his book. So I became patient in a way he had taught me. I watched his hands. I watched which drawer held the ledger key. I watched when the overseers changed shifts. I watched how the sun struck the gallery at noon and blinded anyone looking up from the yard. I watched his wife, Eliza Varnell, who moved through that house like a woman already haunted. She was not innocent. No white woman in a slave house could be innocent by ignorance, but she was afraid of him too, not as we were afraid, not in the bone, but in the room. She spoke less when he entered. She hid letters. She drank laudanum after supper. Once, I saw her stand behind him in the library while he read from the ledger, her face gone gray with disgust. When he asked what was wrong, she said, "Nothing, Silas." But her eyes had already answered. She knew. The quarterly inspection came every spring. Planters from neighboring counties arrived in polished carriages to walk the gin house, admire the seed stores, talk acreage, and pretend labor happened by arithmetic instead of terror. For Master Varnell, inspection day was theater. He wore cream linen. He carried the silver spyglass. He placed the blue ledger on a small table beside his chair. Then he watched us perform our own exhaustion for guests who called him efficient. April 3rd was the first hot day of that year. Heat rose early from the yard. By breakfast, the kitchen walls sweated. By 10, the field shimmered. By noon, the gallery smelled of coffee, saddle leather, and men who had never bent over cotton unless money fell from it. I had hidden the small glass bottle beneath a folded towel in my apron. My hands did not shake. That frightened me a little. I had expected rage. Instead, I felt clear, like every year of watching had narrowed into one straight line. Master Varnell sat with 2 guests at his side, explaining the advantage of constant observation. That was the phrase he used. Constant observation. Discipline begins, he said, when the subject understands that concealment is impossible. One of the guests laughed. I remember that laugh more than the scream. It was a little laugh, a polite laugh, the sound of a man agreeing to evil because it came dressed in educated words. I stepped onto the gallery with the towel basket. Master Varnell turned his spyglass toward the yard, then toward me. "Mercy," he said. "Why are you off your work?" I lowered my head. "There's a stain on the inspection cloth, sir. From the bleaching room. I was told to show you before it was laid out." He sighed, annoyed, but interested. There were guests present. An error in household order could become another demonstration of his control. "Bring it here." I came close enough to see the little veins near his eyes, close enough to smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that his hand reached toward the towel, not toward me. His gaze stayed on my face. Even then he wanted the expression. So I gave him one. I smiled. Not wide, not wild, just enough. That was the last thing he saw. He screamed my name once, then lost the shape of language. The guests stumbled backward. One knocked over the ledger table. The silver spyglass hit the floorboards and rolled in a bright circle until it stopped against my bare foot. I looked down at it. Then I crushed it beneath my heel. That sound was quieter than the scream, but everyone on that gallery heard it. The overseers came running with pistols. The housewomen froze in the doorways. Men shouted for water, for a doctor, for rope, for somebody to seize me. I did not run. Where would I have gone? I stood over Silas Varnell as he clawed at the air, his face wet, his world closing. Then I said the only words I had saved for him. You studied all of us. Now study the dark. They locked me in the smokehouse before evening. Not the jail, the smokehouse. They were too afraid to move me across the county road while the field hands still knew what I had done. All night I sat beneath hanging hooks and old salt smell, listening to Red Lantern breathe differently. No singing, no shouting, no whip cracks, only whispers. They passed from cabin to cabin in the dark. Mercy took his eyes. Mercy broke the spyglass. Mercy made him scream. I heard Isaac coughing outside the smokehouse wall near midnight. Then a child's voice whispered through a crack. Miss Mercy? I did not answer at first. I was afraid my voice would break. Miss Mercy, he whispered again. Can he see? No, I said. There was a silence. Then Isaac breathed out one word. Good. That was the first blessing I received. I expected death. Everyone did. A slave who attacked a white master did not get a trial in any meaningful sense. She got an example made of her. By dawn, I had put my fear in order. There were things I regretted. I regretted not holding my mother's hand when she died. I regretted every child I had not been able to protect. I regretted the years I had spent believing endurance was the same as resistance. But I did not regret Master Varnell's darkness, not for one breath. On the second morning, the smokehouse door opened. Mistress Eliza stood there wearing a black dress, though nobody had died. Behind her was the overseer Pike with a pistol and a face full of disappointment, as if the law had spoiled his private plans. Eliza held the blue ledger against her chest. For the first time in all the years I had served inside that house, she looked directly at me without pretending not to. He is blind, she said. I said nothing. The physician says there is no hope. Still, I said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the book. He keeps calling for you. That surprised me. It must have shown. Mistress Eliza saw it and gave a small, bitter smile. He thinks you owe him an explanation. No, I said. He wants one last observation. Her smile disappeared. For a moment, she looked almost human. Then she dismissed Pike and stepped inside the smokehouse alone. That act itself was a kind of danger. White women were taught to fear us when it helped them, to need us when it suited them. But she came close enough that I could see sleep had not touched her. I read it, she whispered. She opened the ledger, pages and pages of his hand, tidy, precise, monstrous. I knew there were punishments, she said. I knew he was cruel, but this, her voice thinned. This is not cruelty. This is worship. That was the first true thing I ever heard her say. She turned several pages and stopped. The date was February 19th, the page about the children. I found this after the doctor left, she said. He meant to begin with Isaac. My jaw tightened so hard it hurt. Then I was not too soon. No, she said, you were not. The silence between us held everything a person could not say inside slavery. Guilt, power, hatred, need. Then she gave me an offer so strange I thought pain had made me dream it. You can hang, she said. Pike wants that. The neighbors expect it. Or you can live. I looked at her. At what price? At his bedside. There it was. The punishment, the arrangement. The irony she had polished in her mind all night. Silas Varnell, the great watcher, would need a guide. Someone to dress him, feed him, lead him from chair to bed, tell him where the door was, tell him when sunlight entered a room he could no longer see. And Mistress Eliza wanted that someone to be me. Why? I asked. Her answer came without softness. Because he should never forget who took his sight, and because you should never have to wonder whether it mattered. That was how I left the smokehouse alive. Not free, not safe. Alive. A person learns to work with what history gives her. The first time I entered Master Varnell's room after the attack, the curtains were tied shut. Not drawn, tied. Every mirror had been removed. Every polished tray turned face down. The great observer now lived in a room arranged to hide reflection from a man who could not see it anyway. He sat in a chair near the bed, bandages crossing his ruined eyes, his hands clamped on the arms like a prisoner, afraid the room itself might move. I stood in the doorway. He knew my step. Of course he did. He had written pages about it. "Mercy," he said. His voice had changed. Less command, more edge, a knife after it had struck bone. "I'm here," I said. He turned his head toward me, too far to the left. That mistake gave me a satisfaction I did not expect. "Come closer." I did not move. The air thickened. Then, for the first time in 22 years, Master Varnell corrected himself. "Please." That word did not heal anything, but it opened a door inside me, not to mercy. Despite my name, I had little of that left for him. It opened a door to patience. He had studied me through pain. Now I would study him through need. I stepped forward. He heard the floorboard shift and flinched. That was my first note. Not written. Remembered. Subject V responds sharply to approach from the right. Fear concealed behind anger. Denies dependence, but hands betray it. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was exact. He had taught me the language of his own undoing. Over the next weeks, the house revolved around his blindness. He could not pour water without spilling it, could not button his shirt without cursing, could not cross the room without reaching ahead like a child in a storm. Every ordinary task humiliated him because ordinary tasks had never belonged to him before. He had lived like the world existed to arrange itself around his body. Now a chair 6 inches out of place became an enemy. A cup too far to the left became a threat. A closed door became a wall. I did not beat him. I did not starve him. I did not do 1/10 of what he had done to us. That was not necessary. I only let the truth of his condition arrive without comfort. When he asked whether the day was clear, I told him the light was beautiful. When he asked if people in the yard were staring, I said some. When he asked for the blue ledger, I said, "Mistress keeps it locked." The first time I said that, he shook so hard the teacup rattled against the saucer. "My work," he whispered. "No," I said, "our suffering." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He had no sentence for a subject that answered back. The plantation changed faster than he did. Men in the field stopped straightening every time a gallery door opened. Women spoke in fuller voices near the well. Children ran across the yard without freezing at the glint of silver, because the silver spyglass lay crushed in a drawer in Mistress Eliza's desk. Pike tried to keep the old order with threats, but something had slipped from the place. Not slavery itself. I will not lie and say one blind man broke a system that had chained millions, but his particular kingdom had cracked. The fear no longer had eyes. That mattered. Master Varnell sensed it. Blindness did not make him less clever, only less certain. He heard pauses where there had once been obedience. He heard a laugh cut off too late. He heard footsteps moving slowly when his voice called, and because he could not see the cause, his mind began to invent one. "They are conspiring," he said one afternoon. I was cutting his food into pieces, small enough for him to manage. "Who?" "All of them." I set the knife down. "You taught them to hide things from your eyes. Now you are surprised they can hide things from your ears." His mouth twisted. "You think this makes you powerful?" "No," I said. "I think it makes you dependent." That hurt him more. Power, he understood. Dependence was a foreign language. By summer, he had begun speaking to people who were not there. At first, it was only names from the ledger: Joshua, Dinah, Old Ben. People he had marked, measured, and in some cases buried. He called them into the room as if punishment could still assemble the dead. "Bring subject D," he would mutter from his chair. The defiance response was not complete. I would stand beside the bed and listen. Sometimes, when his mind wandered far enough, he would dictate entries into the dark. "Subject M remains unusually composed," he whispered one humid night. "Possible explanation. Concealed satisfaction. Further pressure required." I leaned close. "Subject Phi confuses memory with authority," I said. "Displays agitation when denied instruments of control." He went silent. Then he turned his bandaged face toward me. "You mock my work. I continue it." The words left my mouth before I had weighed them. For a second, I felt the danger of becoming what I hated. Not because I pitied him, because I recognized the pleasure. The clean, cold pleasure of naming another person's collapse. That night, I walked out behind the quarters and washed my hands in a rain barrel until the skin burned from cold. Aunt Rosetta found me there. She was old enough to have seen 3 generations of white men confuse ownership with immortality. "You shaking because you sorry?" she asked. "No." "Then why?" I stared at the dark water. "Because I understand him more than I want to." She nodded. "That is how poison works. It don't just burn what it touches. It asks to be carried." Those words saved me from making revenge my only religion. After that, I still watched him, but I would not become his mirror. When he stumbled, I did not laugh. When he wept, I did not comfort him. When he raged, I did not answer, unless answer served a purpose. My revenge became narrower, cleaner, not to make him suffer endlessly, to make him understand one thing before death took him. He had never owned the meaning of our pain. He had only recorded his ignorance in fine handwriting. By October, the fever came. His body, which had once been kept from every hardship, failed under fear faster than an old mule under winter harness. He stopped eating. He slept badly. He woke calling for light, not lamps. Light. "Open the curtains," he begged one morning. "They are open," I said. They were not. I do not know why I lied. Maybe because he had lied to me about my brother. Maybe because some small cruelties plant themselves deep in bloom when the weather suits them. He reached toward the window, his hands trembling. "I can feel it," he whispered. "There must be light." I looked at the tied curtains, then at him. For a moment, I saw not a monster, but the wreckage left after a monster loses its instrument. That was not forgiveness. Do not mistake it. It was clarity. I walked to the window and untied the cords. Sunlight entered the room in a pale sheet. It crossed his knees, his hands, his covered eyes. He lifted his face as if warmth might become sight if he wanted it badly enough. "Is it bright?" he asked. "Yes." "What does it look like?" I could have hurt him then. I could have described every beautiful thing he would never see again. The dust turning gold, the live oaks moving. Isaac running past the pump with two other children, laughing because no one on the gallery could fix him in a circle of glass. Instead, I told him the truest thing. It looks like the world continuing without you. He began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just a dry, broken sound that seemed to come from a place pride had kept sealed for 50 years. He died 3 days later, before dawn, with rain tapping the shutters. The physician said fever. Pike said divine judgment. Mistress Eliza said nothing. I stood at the foot of the bed while the house realized its master was gone. I felt no victory rise in me, only distance. Like I had been holding a heavy door shut for 22 years, and at last something on the other side had stopped pushing. The funeral was small. Neighboring planters came, because white society has manners, even when it has no mercy. They spoke of his discipline, his intellect, his tragic accident. No one mentioned the blue ledger. No one mentioned the children he had planned to study. No one mentioned the spyglass. I stood with the house servants behind the family line, my hands folded, my eyes on the dirt. When they lowered Silas Varnell into the ground, I did not look away. He had watched everything. I owed him the same courtesy. 3 weeks later, Mistress Eliza called me to the library. The room had changed. The desk had been cleared. The curtains were open. The blue ledger lay in the center like a dangerous animal sleeping. Beside it sat a folded paper. I am selling Red Lantern, she said. I waited. I cannot remain here. I still waited. She touched the folded paper. This is manumission. Yours. My breath did not come right. Freedom is a word too large to enter the body all at once. It stood outside me first. A shape, a rumor, a possible weather. There is money as well, she said. Enough to get you west. Enough not to starve before you find work. Why? She looked at the ledger. Because I lived in this house and called silence survival. That answer was not enough, but it was more than most guilty people ever give. Then she pushed the ledger toward me. Take it. I did not touch it. That book is his. No, she said. That book is evidence. The word changed the room. Evidence. Not confession. Not memory. Not nightmare. Evidence. She wanted me gone. Yes. She wanted the past buried far from her name. Yes. But she also knew what the book could do if it stayed in white hands. It would be burned. Hidden. Dismissed as madness. In my hands, it became something else. A weapon that did not need to blind anyone. I will not promise silence, I said. Mistress Eliza closed her eyes. For a moment, I thought she would take back the paper. Instead, she nodded, then promised timing. I understood. There were still chains outside that room, still patrols on the roads, still laws made to turn free black breath into suspicion. A ledger could tell the truth and still get its carrier killed if shown at the wrong door. I will keep it, I said, until the truth can live longer than the one telling it. That was the only promise I made. I left Red Lantern before winter, not with a parade, not with justice complete. I left with a cloth bag, a paper folded against my chest, and a blue ledger wrapped in brown linen. Aunt Rosetta kissed my forehead at the road. Isaac hugged my waist and tried not to cry. He was taller by then, still coughing, still alive. That was one answer the ledger never got to record. I traveled west under a name I chose for myself. Mercy Clay became Mercy Bell. Bell, because I wanted a name that could carry sound farther than a scream. In Texas, I worked laundry first, then cooking, then nursing. I married no one, had no children of my own, but children found me, as they often find the woman who has survived enough to know where the floorboards are loose and where bread can be hidden. For years, the ledger stayed beneath my bed wrapped in oilcloth. Some nights I would wake afraid it had started whispering. Other nights I took it out and read one page, only one. That was all the poison I allowed at a time. I learned the names he had reduced to letters. I wrote the full names in my own hand wherever I could remember them. Subject D became Donna Morris. Subject J became Joseph Pike, not kin to the overseer, though the name made me angry every time. Subject M became Mercy, not specimen, not subject, Mercy. In 1871, 6 years after the war ended, a teacher from a freedmen's school in Austin came to my door asking about plantation records. She was collecting testimony, not gossip, not legends, testimony. I brought her the ledger. She removed her gloves before touching it. I still remember that. She read 3 pages and had to sit down. This must be copied, she said. No, I told her. It must be understood. So we worked slowly. Names first, dates second. What his words claimed, what our lives meant. The first excerpts appeared in a small abolition paper that winter. They did not print the worst passages. Some horrors do not need full display to prove themselves. The educated men who had once admired planters like Silas Varnell now had to face what education had helped conceal. His careful sentences became witnesses against him. His clean language made the filth clearer. His ledger, meant to turn human beings into specimens, became a record of human beings surviving the gaze that tried to erase them. People asked me, later, whether I was proud. That was the wrong word. Pride is too bright for what I carried. I was satisfied. I was tired. I was grateful Isaac lived long enough to have a son. I was grateful Aunt Rosetta's warning had reached deeper than revenge. I was grateful that when the time came, I had not burned the book, because fire would have given Silas Varnell one last mercy. It would have made his evil private. I chose the harder thing. I let him speak, and I let the world hear what kind of man speaks that way. In my last years, I kept the crushed silver spyglass beside the ledger, not as a trophy, as a correction. One object had helped him watch. One book had helped him name what he thought he saw. Both failed him, because the people he studied were never still enough to be owned by his descriptions. We had names he did not write, memories he could not measure, plans he did not see. And one of us had hands steady enough to end his watching. Silas Varnell believed power meant seeing without being seen. He was wrong. Power can be a woman in a washroom, listening carefully, a child whispering through a smokehouse wall, an old woman warning that poison asks to be carried, a ledger kept hidden until the world is ready to read it. He spent his life turning people into entries. In the end, one of those entries outlived him.